Romanian orphan studies, the effects of institutionalization, is a topic in attachment in the AQA Psychology Paper 1. First of all, let's define the concept of institutionalization. So far, you might have looked at maternal deprivation and short-term separation. Privation refers to situations where attachment does not form, and this is likely to happen in an institutional care setting. The institution is a place like a hospital, children's home, hostels, orphanages, where children live in a long-term situation. The process of institutionalization that is mentioned on the syllabus is the effect of living in institutional settings, and it boils down to, in summary, a loss of personal identity. We've seen that already in Zimbardo's study, that sense of de-individuation, and that could be one of the effects of institutionalization. The others we'll be looking at through the lens of the Romanian orphan studies that are also mentioned in the syllabus. Because the syllabus talks about Romanian orphan studies, it's worth knowing more than one. The most famous and well-known is the first one. We'll go through in more detail, but then we'll do a second one in less detail, just so if it says studies plural, you're able to address that. So the English-Romanian adoptee study by Rotter was published in 2011 because it was a longitudinal study over a number of years. So it was started much earlier in the 1990s. The sample was 165 orphans adopted in Britain, and the control group was British children adopted around the same time. And the question is whether good care can make up for poor early experience in institutions. This is because the Romanian orphans was a scandal, because the institutions that they had been set up in were in dire conditions, and also they didn't receive any substitute care in those institutions. The carers were actually instructed not to make eye contact, not to attach to a specific child, because that would make the caring harder, because they were completely overflowing with children, because people were just not able to take care of their own children, and they were putting them up for adoption. But the volume of children was such that the carers couldn't manage, and therefore they were ignored most of the time and kept in their cots for up to 23 hours a day. So as I said, this is a longitudinal study where the children were assessed for their physical, cognitive and emotional development at ages 4, 6, 11 and up to 15 years old. So to look at the immediate effects of institutionalization, and also whether they are long-term or whether they can be reversed. First of all, the baseline, the starting point, that when the Romanian orphans first arrived in the UK, half of them showed what was defined by Rotter then as a form of mental retardation, and therefore they were showing significantly low levels of IQ for their age. They were also severely undernourished, meaning that they were small for their age, and they were generally quite dysfunctional. This wasn't shown in the control group, and that's showing that the kind of conditions in the Romanian orphanages were particularly dire. Now, the cutoff line, there were 3 kind of subcategories of children that showed very different patterns. Those adopted before 6 months found that had an average IQ of 102, showing that after they were found, they were able to completely recover and develop as normal. The ones adopted between 6 months and 2 years, so still within that critical period, did show a lower than average IQ with an IQ of 86. The average IQ is 100, so this is below average, although not kind of statistically significant to the point that it would be seen as a cognitive impairment. But those adopted after the age of 2 years had a significantly low level of IQ. These are figures you do want to note down and know about, because you need depth and breadth of knowledge of these studies, because they can ask you a 16 mark on these studies only. They did that in 2023, I think. Another finding, as well as the low IQ levels, was that the children showed disinhibited attachment patterns. This is a different type of attachment. It's a pathological type of attachment, so it's outside of Ainsworth, secure, insecure, resistant, and insecure avoidant types. and these children showed a complete lack of stranger anxiety and actually excessive friendliness towards adults that they didn't know. Rutter's interpretation of this is that by living with so many caregivers and having so many carers in the institution, they would kind of excessively attach to anyone that they would that was available at the time. Those adopted before 6 months were not showing these patterns. Those adopted after 6 months were much more likely to show these patterns of attention-seeking, clinginess, and social behavior indiscriminately directed to any adult. So again, in Rutter's findings, 6 months seems to be the cut-off time where institutionalization doesn't have long-term effects, whereas those adopted after 6 months do show lower than average IQ levels and also dysfunctional patterns of interaction. So the second study is called the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. This was a project where they randomly allocated half of these 136 children who had spent most of their life in institutional care in a foster care environment. So foster care is the next best thing to adoption. It's in a family setting with maybe more than one foster child, but not an institutional setting, a kind of home setting. They first compared the children to children who were not ever been in institutional care, and then they compared the two groups of foster care versus institutional care to see whether the foster care conditions would make an improvement to the institutional care conditions. You want to emphasize the difference between institutionalization and foster care. In the first part of this study, there was a comparison between the children who had grown up in an institution and the children who had not, and the strange situation was used as an assessment for attachment type, alongside reports from carers looking for kind of pathological attachment patterns. The findings quite clearly showed dysfunctional patterns of attachment in the institutional group, with 74% of the control group showing secure attachment, so average or above average, compared to only 19% of the institutional group. And of the remainder, 65% of the institutional group were classified as disorganized attachment. This is another dysfunctional pathological types of attachment that is beyond Ainsworth's original strange situation patterns of attachment. You might have come across this before when evaluating the strange situation. Main and Solomon in follow-up studies found a fourth type of attachment where baby seems very depressed, they freeze or have a blank or dazed expression when held, and they show disturbing behavior such as rocking up back and forth, and kind of these seem to be forms of self-comforting, and 65% of the institutional groups showed these patterns in their research. The second part of the research was focused more on cognitive development and the recovery of cognitive development attributed potentially to foster care, and that was when they split the groups into foster care with those who remained in the institutional setting, and they found that foster care group exhibited significant improvements in cognitive function compared to the ones that remained in institutional care, and that the earlier the children were placed into foster care, the greater the cognitive skills observed. So this obviously has implications in your AO3 for speeding up foster care processes, etc. In terms of attachment pattern, comparing foster care group and institutional care group, they found that those in foster care were more likely to develop secure attachment compared to those in institutional care. However, some children continue to exhibit social and emotional difficulties even if they have been brought into foster care. This does support the idea of a sensitive or critical period, and that cutoff line does seem to be about 2 years of age, meaning that those placed in foster care after that time did seem to have some long-lasting impairments in terms of their social, emotional development. So now we're going to move on to evaluation. Some things to consider when evaluating research could be confounding variables, bias, attrition, causality, real life application and external validity. Just to make it a bit easier and to provide another mnemonic that might work for you, alphabetically you can put them into attrition, bias, confounding variables, direct effects or causality, external validity, and financial implications. So we'll look at them in this order, not because you should present them in this order for the essay, but just to help you maybe jog your memory with that A, B, C, D, E, F pattern. So the concept of attrition means dropout rates, and in longitudinal studies this is always a risk, because asking people to come back and back and back and back, it almost inevitably will result in some people dropping out. What we can say to contextualize this issue in the context of Romanian orphan studies is that what might happen is that the ones with more severe issues, the ones that were more problematical, whose parents, adoptive parents, were the most overwhelmed, might have disengaged or become untraceable, moved away, or not responded to follow-up requests of participation, meaning that it can be that the study is not showing us the full extent of the long-term damage that occurred in the Romanian orphans. In terms of bias, you could argue and counter-argue. For example, you could say in Rota, a limitation is that the children were not randomly allocated to the conditions, and we'll come back to that in the next slide. However, the Bucharest Early Intervention Project did address this, and the findings were quite consistent. So although there might have been bias in the original study, the consistency in findings seem to suggest that this is that we can trust the validity of the findings. On the other hand, in Rotta's study, you could argue that a confounding variable was that because the children were not randomly assigned to conditions, it's possible that those who were adopted earlier were healthier, more physically attractive, had nicer personality, where maybe they were smiling. So we can question the causality. Was it being adopted early that made them do better in life, or was the fact that they already had a better predisposition and better qualities that made them get adopted earlier? So we can't be sure of the causal relationship between the early adoption and the better outcomes. It might have been that the predisposition to having better outcomes is what caused them to be adopted sooner. Carrying on looking at causality, we can look at other factors that also challenge the view that the effect of the impairment, emotional, physical, and intellectual, was down to just the lack of an attachment figure, because the issues could also be attributed to the dire conditions of the institutions rather than the lack of emotional care. These children were undernourished, they were kept in cots for most of the time, the hygiene was very low, so there's so many variables that we can't say that all the issues that they presented with were down to the lack of emotional care. In terms of external validity, you can look at the fact that all participants are Romanian. You can question the population validity. Personally, I think it's potentially quite a weak point to be made. You can also look at the ecological validity. That is, I think, a stronger point. Leading on from the previous point, the conditions are very specific. So drawing conclusions about the effects of institutionalization in general based on the very specific conditions of the Romanian orphanages at the time might be a misconception, looking at kind of universality of conclusions when in fact they're quite idiosyncratic to the specific circumstances at the time. In terms of economic or financial implications, as we mentioned before, it shows how important it is to prioritize funding for good care in orphanages, training for carers to give consistent substitute emotional care. You could also argue better pay for carers to reduce staff turnover in order for them to develop some sort of attachment bond with the children in care. And finally, speeding up the adoption process, because what has been seen undoubtedly is that time is of the essence, and the sooner someone is in an adoption or in a foster setting, the better it is.